Welcome to Active Defense. My name is Eric. This channel is dedicated to showing the world that all use of guns by regular citizens isn't crime-based, but typically used lawfully for active defense. This video, for example, is to show the first people to use firearms in the United States. Given that today is Independence Day, it seemed appropriate. So this video will focus on the first battles by militiamen, and I'm talking regular military-age citizens, not professional military forces. And this is how the founders viewed the militia. Please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to your right. And please become a patron to our channel by the Patreon link in the description. Also, please share your thoughts on active defense, as well as how our founders provided for our national defense. Let's get into it. Hey there, this is Active Defense, episode 4, and given that this is now Independence Day, I figured that I would return back to the original, the progenitors, if you will, the ancestors of our Second Amendment, and why they even encoded that into our Constitution. And by that token, I have gone to some of the first battles of the Revolutionary War. So these are all by the Patriots, all by the colonists at the time, the militia members. Now, just to clarify, for the founding fathers, militia did not mean what we have now with the National Guard. Militia meant all able-bodied members of all able-bodied citizens that could fight. So, at that point, it was all military-aged males. I believe it was 18 and older who were able to fight. That was the militia. And so it wasn't a, strictly speaking, official force. It was just all citizens, so all patriots. So that being said, we'll go back to this. I'll go a little bit, I'll read into each of their backgrounds a little bit. Okay, first one is the powder alarm. Powder alarm was a major popular reaction to the removal of gunpowder from a magazine. A magazine was basically what we would consider an armory nowadays, just a place where they stored weapons and powder. By British soldiers under orders from General Thomas Gage, Royal Governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, on September 1st, 1774. In response to this action, amid rumors that blood had been shed, alarm spread through the countryside to Connecticut and beyond, and American patriots sprang into action, fearing that war was at hand. Thousands of militiamen began streaming toward Boston and Cambridge, and mob action forced loyalists and some government officials to flee to the protection of the British Army. Though it proved to be a false alarm, the powder alarm caused political and military leaders to proceed more carefully in the days ahead, and essentially provided a dress rehearsal for the battles of Lexington and Concord 7.5 months later. Furthermore, actions on both sides to control weaponry, gunpowder, and other military supplies became more contentious, as the British sought to bring military stores more directly under their control. The Patriot colonists sought to acquire them for their own use, so they could defend themselves from the tyranny of the British military. So, like I said, the whole point behind the Second Amendment is to allow for individual citizens the right to protect themselves from the tyranny of others. In this case, it's government, but it could just be from the tyranny of criminals or what have you. You can read more into the background on this, but I figured I'd at least show you a bit of it, and obviously I'll be providing links to each of these events. Fort William and Mary. Fort William and Mary was a colonial fortification in Britain's worldwide system of defenses, defended by soldiers of the province of New Hampshire who reported directly to the royal governor. The fort, originally known as the Castle, was situated on the island of Newcastle, New Hampshire, at the mouth of the Piscataqua, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, River estuary. It was renamed Fort William and Mary circa 1692 after the ascension of the monarchs William III and Mary II to the British throne. It was captured by Patriot forces, recaptured, and later abandoned by the British in the Revolutionary War. The fort was renamed Fort Constitution in 1808 following rebuilding. The fort was further rebuilt and expanded through 1899 and served actively through World War II. So, it was captured by patriots, citizens who were actively defending themselves from, in this case, from the aggression of the British, from the aggression of the British throne and military. So, the next one. Battles of Lexington and Concord. The battles of Lexington and Concord were the first military engagements of the American War, the American Revolutionary War. The battles were fought in April 19, 1775 in Middlesex County, province of Massachusetts Bay, within the towns of Lexington, Concord, Lincoln, and Menotomy, present-day Arlington, and Cambridge. They marked the outbreak of armed conflict between the Kingdom of Great Britain and its 13 colonies in America. In late 1774, colonial leaders adopted the Suffolk Resolves in resistance to the altercations made to the Massachusetts colonial governments. Now, one thing to think about is this: they didn't just randomly enter into the colonists never randomly entered into conflict. They weren't emotionally driven. I mean, yes, they were angry and they wanted to respond, but they always wrote down what they did. They always made sure that it was known and that it could be responded to, and they considered writing this stuff down as to be a very responsible thing to do. They weren't going to be an unruly mob about this. This was done in resistance to the altercations made to the Massachusetts colonial government by the British Parliament following the Boston Tea Party. The Colonial Assembly responded by forming a patriot provisional government known as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and calling for local militias to train for possible hostilities. The colonial government exercised effective control of the colony outside of British-controlled Boston. In response, the British government in February of 1775 declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. About 700 British Army regulars in Boston under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith were given secret orders to capture and destroy colonial military supplies reportedly stored by the Massachusetts militia at Concord. Through effective intelligence gathering, Patriot leaders had received word weeks before the expedition that their supplies might be at risk and had moved most of them to other locations. On the night before the battle, warning of the British expedition had been rapidly sent from Boston to the militias by several writers, including Paul Revere and Samuel Prescott, with information about British plans. The initial mode of Army's arrival by water was signaled from the Old North Church in Boston to Charlestown using lanterns to communicate, one if by land, two if by sea. The first shots were fired just as the sun was rising at Lexington. 8 militiamen were killed, including Ensign Robert Monroe, their third in command. The British suffered only 1 casualty. The militia was outnumbered and fell back. The regulars proceeded on to Concord, where they broke apart into companies to search for the supplies. At the North Bridge in Concord, approximately 400 militiamen engaged 100 regulars from 3 companies of the King's troops at about 11 a.m., resulting in casualties on both sides. The outnumbered regulars fell back from the bridge and rejoined the main body at British forces at Concord. The British forces began their return march to Boston after completing their search for military supplies, and more militiamen continued to arrive from neighboring towns. Gunfire erupted again between 2 sides and continued throughout the day as the regulars marched towards Boston. Upon returning to Lexington, Lieutenant Colonel Smith's expedition was rescued by reinforcements under Brigadier General Hugh Percy, a future Duke of Northumberland, styled at this time by the courtesy title of Earl Percy. The combined force of about 1,700 men marched back to Boston under heavy fire in a tactical withdrawal and eventually reached the safety of Charlestown. The accumulated militias then blockaded the narrow land accesses to Charleston and Boston, starting the siege of Boston. Ralph Waldo Emerson describes the first shots fired by the Patriots at North Bridge. It is conquered him as the shot heard around the world. That was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Let's continue on and take a look at two more battles where American patriots, the militiamen, regular citizen soldiers, so to speak, they took up the cause to defend liberty. The Siege of Boston from April 1775 to March 1776 was the opening phase of the American Revolutionary War. New England militiamen prevented the movements by land of the British Army, which was garrisoned in what was then the peninsular town of Boston, Massachusetts Bay. Both sides had to deal with resource, supply, and personnel issues over the course of the siege. British resupply and reinforcement was limited to sea access, which was impeded by American vessels. The British abandoned Boston after 11 months and transferred their troops and equipment to Nova Scotia. The siege began on April 19th after the battles of Lexington and Concord, when Massachusetts militias blocked land access to Boston. The Continental Congress formed the Continental Army from the militias involved in the fighting and appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. In June 1775, the British seized Bunker and Breed's Hills, from which the Continentals were preparing to bombard the city, but their casualties were heavy and their gains insufficient to break the Continental Army's control over land access to Boston. After this, the Americans laid siege to the city. No more battles were fought during this time, and the conflict was limited to occasional raids, minor skirmishes, and sniper fire. British efforts to supply their troops were significantly impacted by the smaller, more agile American forces operating on both land and sea, and the British consequently suffered from a continual lack of food, fuel, and supplies during the siege. In November 1775, George Washington sent Henry Knox in a mission to bring to Boston the heavy artillery that had recently been captured at Fort Ticonderoga. In a technically complex and demanding operation, Knox was able to bring the cannons to Boston in January 1776, and by March this artillery had fortified Dorchester Heights, which overlooked Boston Harbor. This development threatened to cut off the British supply line from the sea. British commander William Howe saw his position as indefensible, and in March 17 he withdrew his forces from Boston to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Battle of Fort Ticonderoga. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga occurred during the American Revolutionary War in May 10, 1775, when a small force of Green Mountain Boys led by Ethan Allen and Colonel Benedict Arnold surprised and captured the fort's small British garrison. The cannons and other armaments at Fort Ticonderoga were later transported to Boston by Colonel Henry Knox in the noble train of artillery and used to fortify Dorchester Heights and break the standoff at the Siege of Boston. Capture of the fort marked the beginning of offensive action taken by the Americans against the British. After seizing Ticonderoga, a small detachment captured the nearby Fort Crown Point on May 11th. 7 days later, Arnold and 50 men raided Fort St. Jean on the Richelieu River in southern Quebec. seizing military supplies, cannons, and the largest military vessel on Lake Champlain. Although the scope of this military action was relatively minor, it had significant strategic importance. It impeded communication between northern and southern units of the British Army and gave the nascent Continental Army a staging ground for the invasion of Quebec later in 1775. It also involved two larger-than-life personalities in Allen and Arnold, each of whom sought to gain as much credit and honor as possible for these events. Most significantly, in an effort led by Henry Knox, artillery from Ticonderoga was dragged across Massachusetts to the height commanding Boston Harbor, forcing the British forces to withdraw from that city. So there's a lot of overlap in a lot of these stories, but still, it's all basically by people, just regular citizens who joined together in common cause to defend their liberties. Thank you for joining me, and hope you enjoyed these videos. Thanks for watching, and if you're willing, please consider donating at the Patreon link below so that I can continue to improve the quality of the videos, as well as to increase their exposure so the YouTube algorithm puts them in front of more eyes. Have a great night.